Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of The Fourth Leg. This is your host, Philip Reiner. This series is focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command, control, and communications, and its increasingly complicated future. With this series, together with our partner Peter Hayes at the Nautilus Institute, we're going straight to the experts across multiple sectors to discuss the technical and policy challenges associated with NC3. Specifically, here in Season 2, we will discuss the necessity for a secure global crisis communications capability. There's a great deal to cover, so let's get started. So today's discussion is going to be a bit different. In this season of The Fourth Leg, we're diving deeper into the technical risks posed in 21st century NC3 modernization efforts. Almost without parallel are the challenges associated with securing digital systems. So today we are speaking with the High Priest of Coreboot himself, Ron Minnich. He's a software engineer at Google. He's worked at Los Alamos, at Sandia, and has been writing firmware for 40 years. He started the Linux BIOS project back in 1999, which was renamed to Coreboot in 2008, and is now used in tens of millions of Chromebooks. His most recent effort, Linux Boot, is now part of the Linux Foundation and aims to bring the benefits of a full Linux kernel to several firmware environments. Want to know why nothing is secure? Ron's going to explain. Ron, it's truly fantastic to have you join us for the podcast here today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.
So we've been doing this, what we call the Fourth Leg podcast, for well over a year. It started with this conversation at a workshop with Secretary George Shultz and General John Hyten talking about global NC3. And we've covered the waterfront, right? We've talked about complexity. We've talked about engineering failure. We've talked about 9 nuclear weapon states as approaches to complex systems. But we've never had anyone on the podcast who comes to us with the job title of High Priest of Coreboot. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's all about, what that means, and how you came to have really such gravitas in this community of interest?
Yeah, the High Priest of Coreboot is a bit tongue-in-cheek. There was a company that has been kind of on the anti-side of open source firmware for, 21 years now. And somebody in that company kind of gave me that name as almost a derisory name. And I liked it so much, I put it on my business cards. And the other person who has that on his card is Stefan Reinauer. So I invented Coreboot. I started it in 1999. The name back then was Linux BIOS. And then Stefan kind of took the reins in 2008. And so I guess we're the people who kind of made it all happen and as the years went by.
For those who are not familiar, Ron, what is Coreboot?
Oh, Coreboot is open source firmware. And firmware is the essential software that runs the very first time you turn on your computer or when you do a reset or you turn it on and turn it off again. Firmware kind of is the thing that solves the chicken and egg problem, being that computers run software, but only software can load software. So there's always got to be some piece of software in that computer somewhere that's always there, even when it's turned off. And that's what firmware is. And firmware traditionally was, going back 40 years, closed source, proprietary, super duper secret. And in 1999, I started a project to make all that stuff open source, and that was Linux BIOS.
And we're going to dig into a little bit today as to what the upside is for doing that open source. And well, the upsides, if I should be more accurate, right? There's a lot to it. We come to this conversation and we engage with you on these topics because of this very serious set of issues around nuclear command and control. We met through, Eric Gross, who was a colleague at Google. These ideas really coalesced in this workshop we did last fall. Bringing to bear your expertise in this domain, we wanted to make sure that we talked to you early in this second season of the podcast to help the listeners understand the gravity of the problem. The presentation you gave at the workshop last fall, I thought, was incredibly enlightening for everybody in the room. I thought everyone found themselves kind of looking around like, wait a minute, it's that bad? You wrote a paper that kind of summarized that presentation. I think for the listeners, those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, Would you give them a sense of what you put down in that paper and what you talked about in your presentation? If you could just kind of walk us through what the insight is.
So I think the key idea is that if you go back far enough, you could look at a board, look at every chip. When that chip was off, it was off. Most of those chips are kind of passive in the sense that they don't do anything without being told to do something. And that's sort of a 1983 style PC. You've got a board, a bunch of passive chips, one chip that drives the train, and then the firmware is contained in a bunch of other passive chips, and everything is off. Once you turn it on, all the control is from that firmware in those chips. And there's about 8 kilobytes maybe of firmware, on a good day. You can really work out what it does and what it might do. If you took that motherboard and shrunk it down to something the size of your fingernail, that's contained all in, say, a chip of that size, and there are 30, 40 of them sprinkled around a modern motherboard, and they all have little bits of firmware that's all proprietary. I've actually had one company tell me that they are pretty sure on motherboards coming out in a few years, there'll be hundreds of chips with firmware. And just to name a few things, any disk drive, any USB stick, any Wi-Fi, any modem, graphics, keyboard. The keyboard nowadays probably has as much power as the PC did in 1982. The DVD drive, just name it. And you will find firmware, and all that stuff is proprietary. And think about having proprietary firmware in a keyboard. It's watching every password you type. If that firmware could then talk to the network interface, which it probably can at some point, it could send your passwords out in the clear to an adversary. So at every level, every direction you turn, there's opportunity to take your data and give it to an adversary. And that is what I have been so worried about. So I started Linux BIOS because we had a cluster that took at least 15 minutes to boot at Los Alamos National Lab. About 6 months in, I discovered that if I wanted to, I could hide data in places that would persist over weeks, days, and months, and that nobody would know I'd done it. And that was just terrifying. So it began as boy, this thing is slow to boot. And within 6 months evolved into we are in so much trouble we can't even see straight. And the biggest problem at the time was I took that to various places in the government to try and talk about what we ought to do. And the basic response was, well, we run Windows, so there's no such problem here.
What year was that?
It was 2000.
Yep.
I first demoed essentially hiding a secret that nobody knew was there in 2000. And the response was, well, that won't happen if it's Windows. And by the way, please don't tell anyone about this. That was not done in any kind of classified environment. So that's kind of how it was. And then in 2007, I started giving a talk. And in general, I'd give that talk and people would get very depressed. But the thing that never happened really from then to now was the sense of the urgency of how bad it was. I think it's ramped up a little, but mostly in the commercial world, the concern about how bad the situation is. And even then, I'm a little shocked that there isn't more concern.
I think the thing that we often hear is pretty much anybody who operates in regards to this space should just assume vulnerability, just assume breach even with their systems. And what you laid down in fall of last year would indicate that it's even worse than that. That it's down in the core of pretty much anything that you're going to get your hands on for a system. And we'll get into the details of this a little bit more, but is that the bottom line of kind of what you're putting forward?
Yeah, when I was at Sandia, we actually had a visit from a government health agency. They were designing a new network, and they wanted us to tell them how to ensure that nobody'd ever get in. And we disappointed them a little because we said, you should design a network with the assumption that they're already in. And they, that wasn't a welcome message, but that's the only realistic message. And, at the same time, there were people in one government lab. I loved it. It was a VP of the lab who said, we've never had any undetected intrusions in our network. This is the kind of thing, you just deal with this all the time. And the only reasonable assumption for most organizations is they're in. Why are they in? Even if they're not in because they broke through your firewalls or whatever, they're in because you just bought a laptop and it came to your organization with your name from essentially a country that you really don't want to be trusting. and anything could have happened in the supply chain between there and you. So it's actually an extremely bad situation right now. And again, what I don't understand is I still don't understand the lack of urgency, because it's only gotten worse in the last 20 years, not better.
So, Ron, you mentioned in your paper that today we're kind of operating in this world of trust but don't verify as far as models go. And you open the paper saying the goal of Catalink is to build a more trustable system. And you mentioned a way to do that is to build a model with trust and verification as part of it. But if everything is so clearly vulnerable from the silicon all the way through the entire stack, do you think it is really possible to imagine that we can actually create a solution?
Yeah, I don't think we can get perfection. That's just not going to happen. There's a whole series of attacks that have worked out that nobody even thought were possible 3 and 4 years ago. And, I've heard stories, and you can look them up, about people picking up someone's password by picking up emanations from laptops, that kind of thing. So this is not even close to being an easy problem. But what we can do, at least, we can have some certainty that the CPU we just got is running in the mode that we think it's running in. And actually, you can look up Bunny Huang. He's now, I believe, in Singapore or Malaysia. He's actually arguing that if you really want something you trust, there's the thing called a field programmable gate array, which isn't even a CPU until you load a bit string into it that makes it into a CPU. You tend to think a more extreme case, but maybe that's the only sane case, honestly. But in any event, you can take a simple enough CPU, and you can try and get to a fab where you have some visibility into that fab, and have some way of verifying when the CPU comes out that, you're pretty sure there isn't maybe a lot of hidden stuff in there that you don't know about. So you can maybe put it in under a scanning electron microscope. I don't know how far you all want to go, or have it processed on a fab line in the US and every country maybe has a low quality fab line, not state of the art, but it's a RISC-V in this case that we're talking about. So it doesn't need to be a state of the art fab line. It's a very small CPU. From there, we want to verify that all the parts that continue to work as memory, even with no power, we want to make sure we've got a very, very good idea what's in them. And that requires that the code that's in those chips be compiled in an open source toolchain. And that code needs to be open source. So you really have to open everything up. And it's not impossible to do this, but it's not cheap either. And you're really working against the grain of the computer industry, which in the last 25 years or so has worked hard and tried to move toward ever more secrecy. And that's kind of where you're working against the flow. That's the problem.
Yeah, and to my understanding, at least, when all this was kind of starting out in the 50s and 60s, almost all the software was produced by academics and corporate researchers. And so it was kind of this public domain software. I know that the open source revolution didn't come about really until the late 90s. But as we're speaking to sort of a return to this completely open source, can you talk a little bit to the value in building with it, and how that signals transparency perhaps to other countries, other investors, people that use it?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's really funny, looking back. Source code had a weird existence, because I remember hearing a story about an early mini computer, the PDP-8. They were going to deliver it with no software at all, and that had to change. But all the early Cray 1 machines, they went to the various labs and agencies, and every single one of those organizations built a software stack from scratch, why they're also incompatible. So software has had this weird existence where it was almost viewed as that's your problem, here's your computer. And then it went to a lot of competency in the customers. And then the vendors realized there was money in it. And then at some point we made this flip to where it was a thing you sold for money. And at that point you were not going to let people see that source code. And then, of course, we had the reaction, which was, well, we don't know what you're doing, and we want to know what you're doing, so we're going to write our own. And there are a lot of benefits. I mean, the simplest benefit that I started to see in the 90s, companies go out of business. And when they go out of business, their software is lost. So there actually are companies that even today, I worked at one actually, that run their business operations on software that you can't get anymore. They've only got the binary. So there's that issue. Open source survives a company's dying. There's the issue of you need to fix a bug and you can't fix the bug because it's closed source. Well, that problem goes away. You can fix a bug. It's open source. And I had a problem with that all the time with proprietary software. You need to improve the software. And finally, there's a bit more trust when you have more people kind of picking through the software to find problems. And, the idea that many eyes make shallow bugs, that's been pretty thoroughly, I think, disproven at this point, that just having 100,000 people looking at your code doesn't mean it's automatically better. So I like to use the term highly qualified eyes, even if there are only 100 or so, will definitely make fewer bugs. And the other point I like to make is that I don't care how smart a company is, and I don't care how smart the people they hire are. That's one company against the population of the world. And it's almost guaranteed. There are more smart people outside the company than inside the company. So I want everybody looking at the software I run because I'm going to get better results that way.
On the open source question, just to dwell on this a little bit, one of the things that we often hear when talking about this notion that you can build potentially a more reliable, secure comms capability in this Catalink notion, right, is, why would the USG or any other government that needs this for such incredibly sensitive requirements like nuclear command control and communications, why would they want this to be open sourced, and how can you trust it? From your years of experience working in these communities and helping drive them in this direction, what's your sense of how the U.S. government may be able to take advantage of an open source capability? And what about others? You've spoken to a certain extent about Germany and some other countries that are a little bit more open to this concept.
Yeah. Actually, interesting thing here, U.S. government involvement in open source goes back a long ways. If you were to look at an early version of the Linux kernel from the early 90s, you'd find a fair number of places, Software Copyright National Security Agency. And the reason for that was there was a guy named Don Becker who worked at a place called the Supercomputing Research Center in the early 90s. I worked with him for a while. And he wrote a lot of early drivers and network protocol for Linux. And the NSA had a really good, actually, review process and basically said, all right, as far as we're concerned, if it goes out, then anyone can see it, then everyone can see it. So we're okay with the GPL. So Don released drivers under the GPL, and they had an NSA copyright. I think I've never really seen any kind of problem that the government agencies I work with are concerned about quality or risk of open source software. It's usually a problem that people are just unfamiliar with the concept, and it's always frightening to see something unfamiliar. But in general, when I've kind of worked through what it all means with people, they're on board. They see that they actually get more value for their money. Nobody really likes having to go back to one company every time they need to tweak something because there's a time critical bug that has to get fixed. So when you tell someone, you had this bug in 1991, if you think about January 1991, things were kind of hot about that point, and you really didn't want to go back to a company and say, we really need this fixed right now, and have them say, we have a process, you have to line up, we'll do our best. You wanted to be able to fix it and get it deployed. So when you kind of show the time to repair and the ability to get a look inside what the software is doing and the ability to have more control of what your computers are doing, the arguments for open source software actually make themselves. The other thing, if you look, the thing I found really amazing as a person who wrote operating systems that were intended to, in some sense, compete with Linux, the thing I began to realize in the 2010s was that Linux was really taking off in the area of hardening the kernel, coming up with idioms for how you write C being a very unsafe language, but we're not going to change that whole code base. So they've come up with new ways of writing C that are more safe. And then they go through and they They rip all the old bad stuff out and use these new techniques. So I haven't seen that same level of quality applied to most of the proprietary operating systems that are out there. They just don't have the resources. Again, if I am a company with an operating system, I'm one company. If I'm a company using Linux, I'm 100,000 companies. So that argument is not lost on the people I've worked with in the government.
As part of the Catalink project here at Tech4GS, as well as our colleagues over at the Nautilus Institute, together we're really focused on trying to incite some sort of action and some sort of influence into these worlds. Would you say there still remains an element that we can engage in via this project, some way we can incite the change and encourage it?
Yeah, I think your timing's good. So what's happened in the last year, what I'm seeing is the processor architectures that come without restrictions are really taking off. So let me say what I mean by that. If you want to build an x86 CPU or an ARM CPU, you have to go to a company. You have to get a license. You won't get a license for x86 at this point. You can get a license for an ARM because that's how ARM does their thing. But, it comes with some restrictions on what you can do to some extent. On the other hand, if you look at the RISC-V instruction set, and the key thing here, everyone says it's an open source instruction set. That's not really quite the right way to say it. It's an instruction set and design that comes without a licensing agreement. So if I want to take that RISC-V instruction set and even a design and that I have the Verilog for and tile 1,000 of them on a chip, it won't cost me any more to put 1,000 on than it would to put 100 on. So I can start to really think about doing things very, very differently because I'm not paying a little bit of money for every single one of those things I put on a die. So people are getting really creative around this RISC-V community. If you really look, there's probably a new RISC-V company every couple of weeks.
So I think something that would be really useful at this point for folks that are out there who haven't been in this conversation, who may not be familiar with these communities and are definitely probably not familiar with what we've kept saying now over and over again, RISC-V. What is RISC-V? How does it fit into this Catalink notion? What is the RISC-V Foundation? Where does it play into this?
I really jumped the gun there. So starting, I don't know how long ago, UC Berkeley would do these basically class exercises almost. And it started with, not surprisingly, RISC-1, real original naming there, I guess. And they would go through this entire process of let's design a better computer design from the ground up. And this is called an architecture. And architecture basically kind of means what are the instructions that the computer processes? Things like add, load from memory, store to memory, all this kind of thing. And so they would basically take a look at what programs do we run? How do we design a computer that is a really good match to the set of programs we run, accepting that it's always a compromise? If you could build a single computer that did nothing but run Excel, it would be a very, very different computer than one that did nothing but run PowerPoint. So computers are just a giant ball of compromise, and over time, the compromises change. So if we look back at where, let's just pick on the x86 again from the 1970s, back then, spreadsheets barely had been invented. The idea of desktop publishing did not exist. Nobody knew what a mouse was. And that's kind of the era of the x86, and it actually derives from computer that was designed to go into a desktop calculator. So that's the beginning. That's kind of how the x86 began with the 4004. And by a process of evolution, it got us to where we are. Now, the x86 is full of very antiquated instructions, and that further it comes again with a license. So the RISC work proceeded in cycles 1 through 5, and in 2010, was the cycle for the RISC-V. And the way Dave Patterson told the story, to his surprise, he found out a lot of people outside Berkeley didn't view this as a grad student exercise in some sense. They viewed it as something they wanted to have. So it kind of made its way out of Berkeley, and there were a couple of companies and organizations created that picked up on this. One of them is Low Risk, and here's a disclaimer. I'm on the board of Low Risk. It's a nonprofit in England, and their goal is to, I guess, just get RISC-V processors out and about. And they actually work with Google on the Open Titan effort, which is a silicon root of trust, and which is also a RISC-V CPU. So there was a lot of interest in RISC-V, and it grew, and the grad students involved got their PhDs. And when they got out, they started kind of two things along with the professors like Kirsty, I just forgot his last name, Asanovic, I think, from Berkeley. They started the RISC-V Foundation, which is a nonprofit, which is sort of chartered with maintaining the design of the architecture in common and working on modifications and extensions and improvements to the architecture, that kind of thing. And then Sci5 is a company which builds processors and designs new and improved RISC-V processors. And those designs are not open source. They have the unlicensed instruction set property, but their designs are proprietary. So you buy a chip from them, but you don't necessarily get all the design documents for that chip from Sci5. Low Risk, on the other hand, they produce essentially the Verilog language-based design for a RISC processor, and companies take those Verilog things and then they can stamp out a chip. Now, what's interesting is let's take a look at a company like Western Digital. Every Western Digital disk drive comes with one or more ARM CPUs that help the disk drive do what it does. Every ARM CPU comes with a little bit of money that goes to the ARM company because that's a licensed CPU. And so what Western Digital announced probably, I think, a year or more ago, they actually have, and believe it or not, an open source RISC-V core that they have put up on GitHub. And as far as I know, and I haven't kept up with this, so you'd have to really check with me, I believe their intent is to move from ARM to RISC-V in their products. And it's a compelling argument because the license fee goes away at that point. And other companies have made similar announcements. So this is the big, real revolution I see happening. It's kind of tough on the incumbents that have those licensed instruction sets that is part of their business model. But I think at this point, it is just moving, right? You can buy a $5 board from a Chinese company with a RISC-V 32-bit CPU on it. A couple of other Chinese companies have announced really high-end 64-bit RISC-V CPUs. And so this has really enabled, in my view, architecture innovation to kind of pick up again. We'd really gotten to the point where there are only really less than 5 companies, if you really looked at it, could really push out new CPUs and do architecture work. And now we're seeing this just incredible wave of new companies pushing out new ideas and new processors based around RISC-V instruction set.
I was really fascinated by the Open Titan collaboration and the outcome there. I think, in light of this Catalink project that we're specifically talking about, I think if I'm hearing you right, the bottom line is that starting with something like RISC-V starts you down a path of something more transparent, but also something more inherently secure from the outset. Is that the right read on this?
So the way I view it, you never want to underestimate how smart the people at, let's just say, Intel and AMD and ARM are. Those people are really smart. But even as smart as they are, the bad guys have poked holes in their machines and found ways to get around some of the security controls. So the argument is, and I think it's a pretty strong argument, that if I have a RISC-V design, first off, it's a far simpler architecture. Dave Patterson used to point out that the ARM v8 spec was a couple thousand pages, and the first RISC-V spec was 138 pages. So you're beginning with a far simpler architecture. Partly that means you're not going to get the compute throughput you get with these more complex systems, but it's comprehensible. Then you're also adding to that lots and lots and lots of open source implementations. You can pick one. You can have anybody come through it and look for problems. You can simulate it. You can put it in an FPGA. You can have it fabbed in 3 or 4 different places. You can design your validation suite for it. And you can do all this in ways you can't do with the others, because the others, to some extent, are a black box. I have no visibility into an Intel CPU below the instruction set level. And there's a lot of what's called microcode, which is a whole nother almost operating system underneath those basic instruction sets that I have no idea the nature of or what it's doing or where there might be problems. There actually are, I just saw it again, there are groups, security research groups now that are trying to crack their way into the microcode level of x86 CPUs. And, I'm impressed by those people. They're just very, very impressive efforts. My feeling on all this is I'd rather start with a processor I don't have to try and attack. I'd rather start with something that I have the Verilog for and that I have, in some senses, a known quantity. So that's my preference is starting from there. And I think a lot of people are feeling that way too. These things are fast enough. Maybe I don't need all that performance. And what I really need is something I have a little more trust around because I've got the source code.
So, Ron, I want to quickly kind of wrap back around to the origin story of RISC-V, how it began at UC Berkeley. I have to throw in a Go Bears. I did my undergrad there.
All right. Both my kids went to Berkeley, so yeah.
Oh, Go Bears. There you go. That's awesome. Could you speak a little bit more to how other countries that don't necessarily associate with this like Western-centric narrative, how they have been adopting the RISC-V architecture and design?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't think I know enough to know. I mean, there's a lot of excitement now around the RISC-V, and it is because it's open in a way that things haven't been open in a long time. I work with a lot of people in different countries because of Coreboot. I get a really definite sense that people want to see RISC-V move forward and grow. As for the main thing I see from people I know in Asia, all the action that I'm familiar with at the moment is in China. And real innovation occurring there, and a lot of that innovation results in open source implementations of the RISC-V, where the Verilog is available. So I think that it's going to be important for companies to look hard at this unlicensed instruction set model. And by the way, IBM has got their Power architecture, which is sort of rapidly moving toward this open model. So it's not just the RISC-V that does it. It's just that they really have the momentum because they got there first. But I think that we may see more of it. But at the moment, what I'm seeing is it is open.
The interesting thing here, and we talked a lot about this in your presentation back in the fall of last year, and in your paper, you start to go into this as well, right? So there's the hardware element of this, the RISC-V potential solution as part of this Link idea. Then there's this whole other layer of complexity, right, on the software side of it. You start to go into that in your paper. I'm curious if you could dive into it a little bit for us to move away from RISC-V and start going into this other element. What are the requirements for any language used to actually code the software for something like Catalink? You talked about Rust and the importance there of coming at this from kind of a newer perspective. Do you mind walking the listeners through that a little bit?
Yeah. So part of the talk we give on this software project we have called Coreboot, which is a Rust project. There are about 10, 15 slides in there derived from direct experience over the years on Coreboot and other C-based software. The core nature of C makes it essentially impossible to write software you'd really want to trust. There are things that were done to allow you to write programs in the 70s on the architectures we had back then, essential elements of the language. You're not going to fix them. So you really basically need to kind of throw in a towel, in my view, on writing software you want to trust in C. And I think there's essentially a very broad realization of that, notwithstanding the biggest thing that we all depend on, which is Linux, which is more and more a strict subset of C. But even then, I don't think for anything mission critical, I can't imagine counting on software written in C. So there are a number of efforts out there. Coreboot is one of them, where we're kind of looking at the whole stack. First instruction after power on up, there's no C. And that doesn't mean, it's some other older language. It means it's a newer language like Rust, where you've got a certain degree of trust in the language. The other language we use a lot at Google is Go. And that, in a lot of ways, I kind of prefer that for its simplicity. And the way I think about it is Rust is what you do if you've got this need to have absolutely minimal software size and you're willing to pay sort of the mental price of writing your programs in Rust, because it's definitely kind of gets tricky at times to get that. And Go is a more minimalist language, maybe doesn't have quite the sort of low overhead when the program runs that Rust can achieve, but it's certainly got a lower overhead on my brain when I'm writing it. So there's trade-offs here, right? But the big thing is time to get away from a 50-year-old language that inherently is unsafe.
You just spoke to some of the pros and cons of using Rust versus Go. Which do you think could work best for Catalink, keeping in mind that this is an open source model for design? So each country here has to have internal teams proficient with whether it be Rust, whether it be Go, whether it be another language perhaps, to verify the system is doing what it is told to do. That's a key integral part of having this trusted Catalink system. What do you think is the best option, best path to go down?
Well, and to just foot stomp that, from your experience, do these perhaps other countries have the level of expertise in those languages?
Yeah, this is a good question. I would actually say, given what our goals are for Catalink, it probably can't be Go. Unfortunately, to some extent, this becomes a popularity contest, right? But for Coreboot, we had a choice between a language called Spark, and unfortunately, there are two languages called Spark. So probably most of the audience is thinking, oh, Spark, that thing that people use that's from Berkeley for data processing or something. There's another language called Spark. It was created in Germany. It's a subset of Ada. It was designed for formal verification. And actually, there is code in Coreboot written in Spark. And it's a neat language. Ada syntax has always kind of been off-putting for a lot of people. And so there hasn't been a lot of uptake of Spark in Coreboot. And then there's Rust, which has had a lot more popularity, I guess, I don't know, because it looks like C++ or something, or because when you really get it right in Rust, you really do get pretty minimal code that runs fast. I'm not overly concerned with Rust versus Spark. We went with Rust in Coreboot because in terms of, again, the popularity contest, if you really look, Rust is just exploding in usage. And there's so much good work being done in that community. And what we've learned with Coreboot is the community has been incredibly welcoming and supportive. We come in some days and somebody from the Rust community will have looked at our code and said, hey, here's something you can do better. I've never had that before from any language. So it really has biased us, I'd say, in the Coreboot project toward Rust, just because the community has been terrific. But I hesitate to push too hard, and maybe there'd be something about Spark that would make more sense because of its being designed for formal verification.
A question that I have kind of goes back to a geopolitical perspective. So you've mentioned earlier, the United States kind of does have the historical know-how of dealing with some of the very early computing tech. We were formerly viewed as this neutral party. Unfortunately, in your opinion, not now. Many countries that were kind of late to receiving this tech and may have started with something more advanced. Do you foresee that as being a challenge in teaching them to go back to the time of perhaps the early 80s where there was this focus on the open source, this focus on community, similar to perhaps the community you're seeing with the Rust community? Is that perhaps going to be a challenge, or is that maybe actually a positive that some countries just started out with something more advanced?
So I can tell you what I see from my limited view, because it's a big business. Every year we have an open source firmware conference, and these are engineers Sometimes, though, we get, a radio astronomer. We've had one of them. These are people who show up with soldering irons in hand, and they're all ages. I mean, we have teenagers show up. We have guys in their 60s. Well, that's me. Show up, not just me. And I think these are some of the best practitioners of this business I've ever met, and they're from everywhere. Last time we had someone he'd somehow managed to pay his way from Nigeria. He was a petroleum engineer, but he just really wanted to be there. We've always got people coming from Asia. Even when we don't have people coming from Asia, I have people just contact me and ask for help on various projects related to this kind of low-level programming. So I think there's a hunger out there. I've seen this. And by the way, that most of the people at the OSFC, while there's a huge contingent, I'd say, from Europe and a lot of those from Germany. I'm being a little biased here because some of the people in Germany have come there from Sweden. But the U.S. engineers certainly do not outnumber any other country, if in a big way, if at all. So no, I think there's a hunger. I think people are going to jump on this. I think people will be excited about this because there's a core group of engineers in this business in every country that really wants to know how it works from the ground up. And you really find young people. We have one guy, he was a student from France, and the reverse engineering he had done just shocked me in the quality of it, and also made me feel really old because I don't think I could have ever pulled that stuff off. But it really is quite incredible to see what capability exists. So actually, I welcome you all and we're not going to have it this year because of COVID, but anytime there's an open source firmware conference, anybody listening and any of you want to show up and meet some of the best engineers you're going to meet, that's the place to be. They're great.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. And Catalink hinges on being this collaborative effort, and obviously collaborative meaning not US centric.
Yeah, it's a great time, and it's just a lot of fun. I'm on the various IRC, and these are just some of the most fantastic engineers. And they have to be because they're just digging deep into secrets that companies don't want us to know.
One of the really foundational considerations as we went into this, right, Ron, was thinking about that AES encryption standard and how the encryption community rallied around that and made it such a success. I think that's going to be a core piece of this, and us learning, who's who in that zoo and attending those workshops and conferences, if they go virtual, what have you. I mean, we'll be there. That's absolutely necessary, I think, to think about who in that community we can turn to, right, to have this conversation. So thinking through all the various pieces of this, as you've laid it out, right, there's this significant risk. There's these potential elements of a solution, going towards the RISC-V model. The fact that you and others at Google have really shaped or helped contribute to this conversation on OpenTitan is hugely indicative, at least to me, that this is something that's a potential useful option for something that's reliable and more secure. Going towards a more simple language. This is something we've talked extensively with Eric about, right? The radical simplicity notion goes simpler so that you can actually figure out whether or not it's reliable or not. But really at the core of this, the idea is that, there's stuff off the shelf, but it's not really something you can turn to or rely on. We got to build this up from the bottom with the firmware, the software, the hardware. You've laid all that out. It's got to be as simple as possible. Tapping into these communities, I get the sense, from your perspective, this is doable.
This is totally doable. It's being done. OpenTitan is, just another example. OpenTitan is not just the chip, it's the whole software stack. We can use OpenTitan as a model, and, I'm involved in that, so I kind of know where the pieces are. And that goes right from the design of the chip through the design of the software. All of it's on GitHub. All of it's out there for people to test and, trust and verify. So we have really a trailblazer that has done this work for us, showed us the model, and this is just utterly doable.
Well, that's what this is all about, is trying to find these solutions that are out there in industry that we could bring to bear on these really hard problems. Honestly, to do everything we can to try to reduce the risk of a potential nuclear conflict, right? We can't thank you enough for taking the time, being in the workshop, helping us think through this, evangelizing as the high priest, if you will, of what the solutions can be here. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you for what you're doing. This is very important work. So I'm grateful to help out.
Thanks again, Ron. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. And we will be speaking with the cryptologist Tom Burson about the AES encryption standard competition and much, much more. Be sure to come back and check it out. Until then, subscribe to the pod. We'll see you online. And thanks to everybody for listening. We really look forward to your feedback.